Welcome back to Trending in Education. Dan Stratford, Mike Palmer, joined by special guest, Dr. Mark Sanders. You know him better as Citizen Sanders over there on the Twitter machine. We'll talk to him momentarily. We're going to talk about civics and update previous shows around civic education with election day this week. But Mike, always like to check in. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, and always good to get Professor Mark on the show. So welcome to the show, Mark.
It's great to be here as always.
Oh yeah, and Mark also has been a great promoter of the show out there in the world. So we appreciate that as well. You got in early with us, Mark, right?
I did. I don't remember how early, but it was pretty early, and I'm a fan as well as participant. So I enjoy listening to the show.
Thank you for saying that. But yeah, it's been a little while. And then when we first talked, I think it was about similar topics. It was about civic engagement, and it is election time. So it is November, which is the season when we all think about our civic responsibility. It's one of the few things we're asked to do as citizens is to vote, and then that sort of sets off other opportunities for civic engagement, like serving on a jury, and it's not a lot more than that is asked of us, but it's particularly interesting to think about that in the context of an off year, 2019. So getting back to your question, Dan, I'm doing great, and I'm looking forward to having this conversation, and hopefully folks can think about what we're all doing at this time of year and how we're going to be doing very different things a year from now, because I think the world is going to be activated in a different way by 2020. But I thought it was a good time to kind of get in the mindset, try to get that 2020 mindset, 2020 perspective going early, and think a little bit about the contrast between 2019 and 2020, and how releasing this show now, I think maybe primes us more for the year that's ahead. And then also reminds us that like these things, being a good citizen isn't like a thing you do once a year, or you only do once a year every 4 years. It's something that ideally you're activated in that mindset more often, really throughout your life. So hopefully Mark can help us understand that as someone who's active in the UNC Charlotte community and Charlotte in general, and is talking to young people who are beginning to understand some of these questions. So I think it's going to be fun.
I agree. And Mark, I guess kicking off, there are multiple ways we can jump into the conversation. We have seen a little bit of a resurgence in the idea around civic education with current political climate in our country and what's happening in Washington, D.C. and locally in different places. Have you seen a resurgence in your research on campus in the idea of not only being civically engaged, but also learning more about it and how to be more engaged?
Yeah, I would say yes is the kind of answer to that, but a couple of different things about it. I think it's still, so we saw, I think I mentioned this on the last time I was on perhaps, but that there was an uptick in student voting and student age voting, and NSOLVE is the acronym, NSLVE. They're an organization out of Tufts University, and they keep track of this, and so there's numbers to back this up. It's not just anecdotal. That student voter engagement, and what they do is they compare the non-presidential years. So, but it's still a big year. So last year, when a lot of Congress, U.S. Senate, things like that are up, that's what they track. And the voting was in the comparable period 4 years ago. So the last 4 years. So they compared, I guess it was 2014 and 2018. So not presidential election, and then they'll compare presidential elections too. But in that comparison, student voting was up. It's interesting that they don't track what we're talking about now in 2019. They don't track these off-year elections where there's not any major federal U.S. elections on. And so when you talk about that, you really have to get down to the local level. And I can talk a little bit about what Charlotte does. But I think no matter where you live, there are people who are concerned and aware and doing things about local politics. And there's some really interesting things that are going on. So student voting is definitely up. In terms of engagement beyond that, I think there are students who are helping out to get out the vote. That it's one thing for me or other faculty or old Generation X or beyond to tell students, oh, it's important to vote. And I'm very upfront with people that I did not think it was that important to vote when I was their age, but I've come to have some different views on that. But it's important for students to hear that from other students. Mm-hmm. That's really important. Beyond that, in terms of getting involved, there are individual students that I know, or groups of students that are doing great things. I don't know if there's an increase in that over 5, 10, 15 years ago. It's unclear to me, and it's hard to track that. Mm-hmm. So I could talk a little bit about the specific things that I know students at the college level or even at the high school level, interestingly enough, are doing. But I don't know, and because that's the last piece. So I think in those things, I think voting's important. Getting students to want to vote is important, making it seem like it's important to kids. But then finding out about what you're voting for.
Right.
And the process, that's a much more difficult sell. That takes a big investment of time. And that's hard to model for anybody unless you're literally in politics. So if college students are looking to adults or other, older adults, a lot of them don't have time to find out about these things. So that's a real challenge. There is an opportunity to use the classroom to help do those things, but there are some issues there as well.
Yeah, and Mark, full disclosure, in case folks haven't heard before, you're a philosophy professor, right?
Yes.
So,
yes.
You teach at UNC Charlotte.
Yes.
And then you head up some sort of program there that's involved with student engagement, or I forget exactly the way to describe that.
So I'm involved with an organization called 49er Democracy Experience.
Okay.
So I'll just say a little bit about them to maybe put it in context. That organization started when the DNC, the convention, came to Charlotte in 2012, maybe was that when it was? Okay. And it continued on, but that was a big kickoff event because it was really important. It continued on, and we focused on voter engagement, getting students to vote. We had things like that. We have different organizations that we have students who work on those issues. Now, the Republican National Convention is coming to Charlotte next year.
Okay.
And so the people that started it in the administration, who kind of receded into the background a little bit, are now back in full force. But it's a big moment for Charlotte and UNC Charlotte. And so we have a building uptown where the convention will be mostly held. Mm-hmm. And I think either CNN or C-SPAN, which are very different entities, but one of them might be headquartered in our building. There will be shows, stuff like that. So it's a much bigger deal. But so the planning for that started last year already.
Okay. Got it.
And there's an example, that's just an example of the tendency to overlook what's happening next week, right? Sure. I mean, the national media and even at Charlotte right now, we're kind of focused on what's happening in 2020.
Right.
And there are things that are happening now that some people are really passionate about, but most people, I would say, don't even know what's on the ballot.
Yes.
Next Tuesday. Or when this podcast airs, it'll be tomorrow, if I'm correct. Yes.
Correct. If we hit our marks, fingers crossed. So today, even if you're listening.
If you're listening, sure, yeah. Or if it's later, you missed it, it's okay.
Yeah, it's all good. What is time?
Yes.
You're a philosopher. Well, that's a separate show.
Well, time is an important. We couldn't have experience without time, so I think time's pretty important. Yeah, but that's another show on the transcendental unity of that perception.
May have other things to say.
Yeah.
I just want to put that out there because I don't really know what that means. But yeah. So I would say from where I'm sitting and from what you just described, to me, this speaks a lot to the crisis of truth that we're all facing nowadays anyway, where concepts like digital literacy, media literacy, what is a good source, and how do I even educate myself as someone who's grown and who needs to vote on there's new proposals around changing the New York City Constitution, and I don't know anything about that, and I'm going to need to figure that out. And it's something that is pushed out, you know, in as impartial a way as possible through, you know, the fact that you're a registered voter. You will get some communication, likely in the mail, that you know, I imagine everybody is getting. If you want to go any deeper to really understand what's true, what's perspective, what am I being told because I've identified in a certain way, and then if I want to be critical about what I'm being told, where do I go? How do I have that conversation? And then even to your point about modeling, like how do I model a critical conversation around my civic responsibility to vote? That's something that I'd love to get your perspective on, Mark, but that's where my mind's going right now. Because like, I feel like, and that's something that I think is a 365, you know, take leap day off, but like, that's a 365 day a year, like proposition for all of us, because I think civil discourse is broken, and writing maybe as, I'm not sure how it's related, but at the same time, we don't know where to go to find the truth.
Yeah.
That's concerning. And then my read on what you're doing is you're trying to activate at a local level. And then can our listeners sort of think about what you're doing and then think about how we could apply that to the rest of our lives?
Yeah. So the question about our understanding of truth is clearly a philosophical question. It is definitely it's a philosophically relevant question, and there's a lot to say about it. The one thing that I would say is that sometimes postmodern philosophy or postmodern thinking gets blamed for the devaluing of truth. That's a very different thing than what's going on when politicians just blatantly lie, right? There are things that we can empirically fact check. And there are things that we can talk about. What does objective truth mean? Can the truth change? Those are different questions. There's a, you know, to use a fancy philosophical word, there's an epistemological relevance to that. And there's not a lot being done on the philosophical side of it. There's some stuff being done, but it's difficult, I think, sometimes for people to kind of to fit in. So that connects then to, I guess, what you would call digital literacy, right? How do I, especially in an online internet environment, how do I discern, you know, good, you know? So I think the term fake news is bad. There is a good categorization between disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation. I think I got those right. About information that's wrong on purpose with a bad intent or a good intent or just confused or whatever it is. There's lots of different, so it's very complex about what people do. Is it, you know, just to confuse people so they kind of tune out? I think that's really what's a lot of what's going on. So I teach a section on digital literacy in my citizenship class and also my intro class, but I don't have I'm not aware of courses about that. And the people involved in digital literacy are mostly media studies folks. Yep. Which makes sense to some degree, but I think that would be a place for philosophers and others to have input in what's going on in that realm. And I know you've had people on before at the high school level or even, you know, middle school level that do this. I think that's the important place to start when you have these digital natives growing up, right. To kind of have that part of their curriculum, and so I think that's crucial to have that part. The last part is the notion of civic duty fits very nicely with political philosophy. So whether it's political science or political philosophy, the idea of what you have an obligation to do, and that civic duty should go beyond just voting and jury duty. It should go beyond that, and you can talk about political obligations for people in that context. So that lends itself nicely to academic and classroom discussions.
Yeah, I just think we need to gamify it. Like, I want a Strava app so I can see how many citizenship points I'm getting. You know, so like when I'm doing something nice, I can have I can be at the top of the leaderboard. You know, or I did the most good things before 10 a.m.
Yeah,
you know?
so
that would be a motivator. You know.
I think I'd want to push back on that a little bit if you were being serious. I'm not sure how much you would.
A little bit of both.
A little bit of both. I can see like that, you know, there's a school of thought like whatever it takes to incentivize people to get into this, do it if that's what you want to use. But I think in the bigger picture, you want to get away from seeing things as competitions,
right?
And seeing things more as you're invested in things with others together.
Yeah.
So there's a kind of big picture issue there, I think.
Yeah. I'm not gonna counterpoint. We'll take that offline.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dan.
Well, you sort of went down the road of talking about news, and we talked a little bit about 2020 overshadowing 2019. And obviously, national news media is focused on national elections, and that makes sense. So how important to you in teaching your students or discussing these matters is opening up their eyes to local media and to local news coverage and to newspapers, campus newspapers, and the like? How important do you think a role that plays in really where information is coming from and being civically engaged?
Yeah, great. So I think it is very important. At the same time, it's very difficult. What I mean by that is, it's hard to show like on a national level. There's the kind of national mainstream media, and then there's people can kind of go and get their own personal news feed, and that's what they do as students too. So we have a campus newspaper that is most students don't get their news from there, and they do cover they cover social stuff too, but they cover some interesting stuff, including local politics. We have 2 students running for a local office, 2 current UNC Charlotte students running for a local office. We had one faculty member who won her election, who sits on the county commissioners board. And so there's that angle, which I'd like to make more use of. And so some of the students who are running have friends on the editorial board of the Niner Times, and they've written about it because for that personal connection. But I don't know how much students get their news from there.
Right.
And I don't know how easy it is to tell them that, you should get your news from the local campus. But local media could also do a better job of covering this. But again, I don't know how much students are aware of local media. It's really easy for students to get involved in whatever corner of information and entertainment that they want to.
Right.
I want to mention one thing that I think was a really cool event that I assume is being replicated in other communities. But so one of the things up for election in Charlotte is the Board of Ed, so the Board of Education. And there's constantly, if you're kind of glued into this, it's the same 20 people constantly Facebook and tweeting about and emailing about the different, but there's tons of debates, tons of events that go on constantly. So much, I can't go to most of them, but the one I made a point of going to was the one that Generation Nation and another organization, ESFR, sponsored. So what those are high school. So Generation Nation is a high school, like civically engaged high school students, and they sponsored the debate at a local school. Mm-hmm. And there's like 15 people running for the Board of Ed, and about 12 of them came. So that was really, really, I thought, a good sign. And so it's hard to get traction in the national media environment, and then how many local events that there are. But I thought it was a really good sign, and I hope, and I would encourage people in their wherever they are to seek out what's going on at even the high school level with the students that are engaged. And I think this high school students being engaged about Board of Election results was really good. So they actually kind of like ran the debate. The students kind of ran the debate, and it was as good a debate as I've seen. And I guess, I'm not really watching the national Democratic debates because I can't deal with it. But I thought it was a really good. They ran a really good event, and so I would hope that there's more events like that in other regionals.
Yeah, I'm glad you went there, because that was the next place I wanted to go, which is more the generational thinking, and something we talk about a lot on this show. And full disclosure for those who haven't heard me talk about it, like I'm not a big believer in indexing by age or generation.
Mm-hmm.
It's an input. It's something you can learn from, but it's dangerous. Stereotypes, meta stereotypes is something we've talked about few different ways on the show, but all that being said, like it is different if you are 17-year-old today than if you were a 17-year-old 15, 20, 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. and at the same time, we're all living in this shared experience that we're in right now. As someone who is engaging day to day with folks from a different generation, as we understand it, any thoughts on that? Like how how there's like a youth movement, and sometimes the new candidates are skewing younger, yet there's still issues around voting ages and the age you need to be president, and then obviously more of a 2020 issue. But how old do we want our elected officials to be? Like, they're not really representative of the age of the populace. They skew much older. So for fear of being tagged as hashtag olds, you probably have to bear that label pretty routinely in your job. How do you think about that? How do you think about the way, first off, just different intergenerational diversity is really important, I think. So like the more people are engaging with folks all across the lifespan and learning from each other is an important point to begin with. But then just generally since we'll use you as more of an expert who talks to quote unquote Gen Z on a more regular basis about these issues, any thoughts about sort of generational sentiment and youth versus older folks, and how people think about how that relates to civic engagement and politics in general?
Yeah, so I think it, like I said, it's promising on an anecdotal level that I see students that are running for office, right? Students who like wouldn't be old enough to hold their position until they get seated. So they're running underage, but they actually would be the right age at the time. So I think those are excellent, great examples. But then there's a sense that like if you follow them, it's like that becomes all consuming for them, and it's hard to be a student and be. So there needs to be a model where you're not that engaged at the level that you have to run. Although those are great examples, what kind of example is there to be engaged enough to know, what you're talking about? And the way that I try to encourage students to think about this is that. So some students will say, and I think correctly so, that politicians don't talk about issues that are important to them. And I say, well, how many of you voted? And I explain that there's a lesser percentage that the politicians don't necessarily think less of some issues than others. It's they get elected, they talk to those issues about the interest of voters in age groups that actually vote. And I think that does get through to students sometimes. And again, it takes, I think, individual students or young people, not just running for office, but organizing events. So some of the events when, candidates come through North Carolina and Charlotte, the biggest North Carolina all of the time. There's been a lot of work on gun violence out of UNC Charlotte students recently because of the shooting that took place last April. Mm-hmm. And so they're not just showing up; they're actually like the March for Our Lives, because they're actually holding events, and national political candidates are coming to those events. Or we've had students who actually have gone to the Capitol in Raleigh to talk about these issues. And so seeing those students kind of front and center, organizing events in the media, at government places, that's really, 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 I think, important. And it shouldn't take a tragedy like a school shooting to do that. Unfortunately, it does sometimes, but students, they're taught to find their voice always. Mm-hmm. There's a way in which they think about that in not the political realm, but some other realm, whether it's, online or whatever. And so there needs to be an element of that has some political overtones or some space in the public sphere, for them to have that conversation. Because again, they have lots of things at their disposal that they can interject and change the conversation to talk more about things that are of interest to them. Mm-hmm. And lastly, as a hashtag holds, part of it is like, I want to hear from them, because I'm never comfortable organizing student events around issues. And so I say, like, well, I think you'd be interested in free college tuition. That seems like an interesting, I think, or, student loans or things like that. But that's just my, what things are you really interested in? And so getting them to talk about that is one of the toughest things, but it's the most crucial thing before as an older person.
Yeah.
I try to help them. I really am trying to give them a space to voice what they're interested in, but then do it in a way that kind of draws attention from a larger audience.
Yeah, and to that end too, like frequently it's the nature of our society. Power accrues to the older set because you have more time to acquire it. But when you actually have acquired some of that authority, being able to cede it back and to as almost like another opportunity to model, like just an appropriate mode of engagement, because like that also must be, particularly in philosophy. You know, my understanding of it is like, you know, as a philosophy instructor, you need to be critical and engaged in how you communicate to model that for the young minds who are interested and want to learn more. So I know we're coming close to time, but any thoughts on any of that, Mark?
Yeah, so I think that's another way in for it. And again, so as someone who worked in academic philosophy, I often find myself not surrounded by a lot of other philosophers when I am in these events or these areas. It's often political science and other areas, social work sometimes, with people from even psychology. And I'll oftentimes one of them. But I think political philosophers should be involved in this for obvious reasons. But then just even if you're not involved in that, the notion of critical thinking, which is so central to philosophy, is so central to the message of how we should be engaged in politics. So it's not just like, yeah, it's your civic duty to get out and vote, but to engage with issues and to engage with candidates. And it's not just about candidates either, because so one last thing about this election in Charlotte, there is a referendum on the ballot, as there is a lot of local elections, about a sales tax. And it's an interesting issue that you have to critically engage with to really understand. And so I think that's a way for philosophy to enter into the conversation about how to analyze and evaluate and critically engage with the information that you are given. There's another issue of how accessible is that information, how hard should it be to get it, but once you have it, the skills to engage with it and think about it in a certain way is, I think, definitely a place where philosophy can help, or at least I like to think so.
Mark Sanders, professor at UNC Charlotte. Find him on Twitter at @citizen_Sanders. Thanks so much for the time.
Thanks again, Dan and Mike. It's always a pleasure. I look forward to talking to you guys again.
Yep, and with 2020 on the horizon, we will be sure to have you back for discussions around civic engagement and voting as the year rolls on. We have tons of content here at Trending in Education. You always go back and listen to our first episode with Mark as well. It was good discussion there. Be sure to subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, Overcast, wherever you'd like to listen to your podcast. Also, check out trendingineducation.com. We're also on LinkedIn. And check us out on Twitter and Facebook as well. With that said, as always, thanks so much for listening to Trending in Education.